Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Ben Francis and this evening we're joined by Maureen Watt. Hi Maureen, how's it going?
Hi Ben, how are you?
I'm
Enjoying
doing
this
good.
lovely weather?
I know, yeah, no, I'm very happy about it. It's been weeks of just like grey. I'm very excited. We'll start the show as normal with the latest update on the Middle East. So, at least 50,523 Palestinians have been killed and 114,775 injured in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023. A survivor from a massacre of Palestinian paramedics and rescue workers in Gaza has said he saw Israeli troops open fire on a succession of Red Crescent ambulances and rescue vehicles and then use a bulldozer to bury the wreckage in a pit. Munzer Abed, a 27-year-old Red Crescent worker, was within the back of the first ambulance to arrive at the scene of the airstrike in the Hashina district of Rafah before dawn on the 23rd of March, when it came under intense Israeli fire. His two Red Crescent colleagues sitting in the front were killed, but he survived by throwing himself to the floor of the vehicle. On Tuesday, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz announced a major expansion of attacks on Gaza and the, quote, capture of large areas that will be added to the security zones of the State of Israel. The announcement followed a night of airstrikes on Khan Yunis and Rafah in southern Gaza, which officials said killed at least 21 people, including a pregnant woman. The intensification of Israel's offensive comes after more than 2 weeks of airstrikes and ground operations that have, according to Gaza's health ministry, killed more than 900 people. UNICEF has said that at least 322 of those killed since the renewed Israeli attacks have been children. A ramped-up U.S. bombing campaign on Yemen has killed civilians and brought further destruction and uncertainty to the poorest country in the Middle East, compounding an already dire situation after U.S. President Donald Trump cut aid, according to local people, humanitarian workers, and rights groups. Now the rampant bombing has started, you will never know which way things go, said Sadiq Khan, who works as a country director in Yemen for the aid charity Islamic Relief. So, Maureen, what do you make of that update, and specifically, what do you make of the UK's role in Yemen?
I just get more depressed about it every day. I mean, clearly, yesterday and today it hasn't been in prominence in the news because of tariffs, which we'll come on to, I'm sure, later. But
Yeah,
um, it just gets more and more depressing. I mean, I say this virtually every time I'm on, but until Gaza is obliterated and Palestinians are killed, almost all of them, I honestly don't think that Israel is going to stop. And then you wonder, where next? Because they've got the backing of Donald Trump, and he's helping out by bombing the Houthis in Yemen. So it's just, the Middle East is just so depressing at the moment. And as I say, it's not really getting the international attention that it deserves because there's so much going on in the world. But this is typical of Donald Trump, just to try and create chaos everywhere so that people really don't know where to turn.
now moving on to our latest update on the war in Ukraine on day 1135 of the conflict. Vladimir Putin's investment envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, met with U.S. officials in Washington on Wednesday, officials said, as the Trump administration considers business dealings with Moscow even as Russia continues to wage war on Ukraine and refuse a ceasefire. Because of a war, Dmitriev is under sanctions that the U.S. had suspended so he could visit. Dmitriev is the highest-ranking Russian official to travel to the United States on state business since Russia started the full-scale war in 2022. It was not clear what he discussed with U.S. officials on Wednesday. Dmitriev has close relations to the Trump team, dating back to the 2016 election, in which the Robert Mueller investigation found sweeping and systemic Russian interference in favor of Donald Trump. Also on Wednesday, the Trump administration notably did not include Russia on the expansive list of countries that will face heavy new tariffs. Ukraine was slapped with a 10% levy, according to a fact sheet released by the White House. A team from Ukraine may be coming to the United States as soon as this week or next week, the U.S. Treasury Secretary said. The U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. A Russian ballistic missile strike has killed at least 4 people and wounded 14 others in the Kryvyi Rih, the home of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Earlier on Wednesday, a 45-year-old man was killed when a Russian strike hit cars parked outside a house in Zaporizhia. Russian forces unleashed an hour-long barrage of 17 Shahed drones on Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city near the Russian border, late on Wednesday, triggering fires, said the region's governor Oleg Sinkibov, who reported that 5 people were wounded in an attack on the same district earlier on that day. The governor also reported a drone strike on the town of Derachi, northwest of Kharkiv, with 1 person injured. A strike sparked a fire in Chesarevka Lozhivka, outside of Kharkiv. NATO allies have pledged more than 20 billion euros in military support for Ukraine in the first 3 months of the year, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said on Wednesday. Foreign ministers from the alliance are meeting in Brussels today and Friday to discuss further support for Ukraine. Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, arrived in Brussels today for talks, bringing with him Matt Whiter, the newly confirmed U.S. ambassador to the NATO military alliance. More details emerged of secondary sanctions that U.S. senators want to place on countries friendly to Russia if Moscow continues to disrupt peace negotiations. The group of 50 Republicans and Democratic senators are proposing 500% tariffs on imports from countries that buy fuel and uranium from Russia. On Wednesday, Ukrainian authorities accused 5 suspects of involvement in a military procedural scandal that led to swift wartime anti-corruption reforms. The 5, including a former defense ministry department head, are accused of inflating prices while ordering food for troops and embezzling millions between August and December 2022. Also, on Wednesday, Russia and Ukraine accused each other of new attacks against each other's energy facilities, citing a U.S. brokered moratorium, although there is no formal agreement in place as of yet. The IT system of Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk's civic platform party have been hit by a cyber attack, he said on Wednesday. Poland has been on high alert for foreign interference and sabotage ahead of presidential elections scheduled this year in May. So, Maureen, what do you make of the latest update on the Ukraine war?
Well, again, it's very depressing, and clearly Trump has taken his eye off the ball on this. He said he would have it finished, in the first week or something of his presidency.
I think it's 24 hours.
24 hours, right?
That's what I remember.
Yeah. How many times 24 are we on now? Yes, but to be serious, I mean, people are still dying on both sides. Ukraine hasn't got the benefit of intelligence that it had before. And, people are going to and fro, but regrettably, you probably have to say that nothing happens unless Trump says it's going to happen. Talks might continue, but in the end of the day, it is unfortunately up to Trump. And just as I said, Trump, was creating chaos. Putin's doing the same thing. It's clear that Trump learned it from Putin. And, these little strikes in other satellite states, like you mentioned, Poland being disrupted, or Donald Tusk's internet or something being interrupted, are just the kind of things that he loves to do. But it makes us realize that if there isn't a decent settlement in Ukraine, that Ukraine is allowed to survive as an independent country, then Trump and Putin will go after other former Soviet states like Poland. So it's really important that the EU continue to ramp up the aid to Ukraine and its other allies, including Canada and the UK, so that the gap left by the US is filled as soon as possible. Otherwise, as I've said before, Russia will go into any talks thinking that it's got the upper hand, but at the moment, Putin's just playing with Trump.
Like, what sort of approach do you think European countries and the UK should take to try and attain peace? Because I guess, as you've covered, Trump's method maybe isn't really working as much as he hyped up to work. But I guess at the same time, the current method also hasn't really been working of just giving arms. So do you think there's like a third way we could try and take to actually bring an end to the death in Ukraine?
Well, thinking about it, perhaps the EU could have more of an active position in any talks. I mean, I'm not sure. What were you thinking in terms of a third way?
Well, I don't actually know. I mean, I guess like you have Trump's proposal of negotiating, and then you have the idea of just, I guess, giving weapons until Ukraine gets a more favorable position, I guess, and then they can try and negotiate on that. I'm not sure what a third way would be, but I guess trying to get some sort of negotiations going in maybe a more effective way than Trump is.
Well, I mean, I think, clearly Putin has got, were calls for a ceasefire, and Putin's obviously got no intention of sticking to any ceasefire. I mean, you're not dealing with rational people here. So you're dealing with horrible, vindictive, nasty male leaders who've got an ego as big as the moon. And, it's extremely difficult. It's not rational at the moment in terms of like international diplomacy. The whole kind of, they both want to disrupt the normal way of doing things. And you can do that if you like, but you need to have some other sort of system in place. Otherwise, the world is in chaos. And as I said, I think that's the way they want to operate, both of them.
So moving to our main story of the night now, tariffs. The US stock market collapses in aftermath of Trump's raft of tariffs against various nations. The US stock market plummeted after Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs on the country's trading partners, causing a ripple effect across global economies. The move aimed at reshaping international trade has raised concerns over its potential economic damage. Trump's tariff plans, which involve a baseline 10% levy and reciprocal tariffs starting in April, have already sent shockwaves through global financial markets. On the 5th of April, tariffs will affect a range of countries, including China, the EU, Japan, and Taiwan. This announcement triggered a significant decline in U.S. stock indices, with the Nasdaq, S&P 500, and Dow dropping 4.5%, 3.5%, 3.4%, and 2.7% respectively. Investors were quick to react to the looming economic instability, with the US dollar falling to a 6-month low. Other global markets, including the FTSE 100 in London and the Nikkei in Japan, followed suit with sharp declines. Economists have warned that such high tariffs could lead to increased prices for US consumer goods, destabilize global supply chains, and negatively impact industries like Scottish whisky and Scottish salmon. The UK government has expressed concern over the tariffs, particularly with regard to the Scotch whisky industry, which could face substantial new costs. In response, the UK government has initiated a process to retaliate against the US with a list of US products, including whisky and other exports, under consideration for tariffs. Despite warnings from major business groups such as the Business Roundtable, which includes companies like JP Morgan and Apple, Trump remained defiant, framing the tariffs as a necessary step towards, quote, fair trade. However, his approach has been criticized for damaging not only American business but also the state of the broader global economy. As the situation develops, the UK government has signalled its intention to seek a trade deal with the United States, but has not ruled out retaliatory measures if negotiations fail. The ongoing trade tensions highlight the unpredictable nature of Trump's economic policies and the uncertainty they bring to global markets, especially for industries like Scotch whisky and Scottish salmon, which are heavily reliant on international trade to keep afloat. So, Maureen, I guess I wanted to start off by just asking you about the impact of it. I guess like more importantly on this country and the people who live in this country. So, what do you think that could actually be?
Well, if you'll indulge me for a minute, Ben, I mean, I think we need to think back as to why we're here in the first place. It must have been during the Thatcher Reagan era that, well, we know in the UK, Thatcher deindustrialized Britain and allowed companies to offshore so that they were producing goods in China and other Eastern countries where the costs of labour were dirt poor and not as expensive as labour in the UK. As long as companies made profits and paid their shareholders, they didn't give a damn about the workers who were laid off in so many companies. So that is influencing Donald Trump's actions. Now we have him trying to get companies to make things in the US again. But what strikes me is that it's jobs that yes, need to be done, but they're not jobs that make workers feel valued, that they've got a chance to go up in the company. They're kind of menial, if you like, jobs like working in factories. Now, I thought the world had moved on a bit from that, and that we were, because the Western countries in general have low unemployment because of their aging populations and things, that we were looking for more high value jobs. But Donald Trump is really, really, really setting the clock back to the 70s, 80s, if not further back. So it's difficult to give an overall picture of how that will affect production and trade here in Britain. In terms of salmon and whiskey, I mean, they're unique products. They have they can't be made elsewhere. Okay, you can get salmon from other countries, but the salmon from South America is not as high quality. So we're talking about high quality goods here. And I think that governments could do things to help, but consumers could do things to help as well. So, for example, consumers, as you said, can stop buying American goods like the Canadians have done spectacularly well on. We could do the same, but we could also think about buying goods that are made in this country. So yes, they will cost a bit more, but they also tend to be made with more sustainable products. So for example, if you're buying something that's made in China or India, it's usually, let's take women's fashion, for example. It'll be made out of polyester, which is a really bad product for the environment. But if you're getting things made out of cotton or viscose even, they're not making such an impact on the planet. So I think there could, by governments, be a kind of call to consumers to make different choices in terms of what they're buying, and also not be such a throwaway society and thinking you have to get the latest pair of trainers and things. Now, I know that's dead difficult, and I remember back to my children needed new school bags every term. I mean, it was absolute, and not every term, every year. It was just ridiculous. So I think there needs to be a rebalancing of the way consumers think about buying. Um, to buy in Britain and not um, from abroad. So maybe you could say, well, that's protectionist, but let's buy Scottish if you possibly can, and even although it costs a bit more, buy less rather than more, but buy better. Um, that's my take on things,
Yeah.
but it'll be difficult to change consumer habits, I suppose.
Well, I was actually going to ask about that, like the broader point, 'cause I think it is quite an interesting point when it comes to tariffs. Like, and you made the comment about do people want to go back to the 70s and 80s? And that sort of links into the question I was going to ask you about, like, potential politics of protectionism, because obviously Trump's doing it and it's against our country, so it was perceived quite negatively. But in the 70s and 80s, before, as you pointed out, the neoliberalism brought on by Thatcher and Reagan, my understanding with the jobs back then were, compared to jobs of my generation, often more secure, often unionized, often you'd get one for life. You'd be involved in making something that was like you could see a real material good for your country, like mining, I don't know, creating key stuff that your country uses, in opposed to now where a lot of agency work, a lot of gig economy work, a lot of jobs where you don't really know what you're doing exactly, a service sector work where you're doing work for like a very rich class in society where you're not really sure if it's needed or not. So, do you think there, I don't know, could be some positives to sort of a global return to more protectionist policies where we like develop our own key industries, in opposed to like unregulated free global trade? Like, what do you think of that?
See, I think that Trump's policies are going to take years and years to implement. I mean, you can't throw up a factory, you know, in a short space of time. Although I noticed today that JCB are opening a factory in Texas to make JCBs. Now, that's quite a big deal if JCB workers start getting laid off in the UK because of this. So I think it's really difficult to know exactly how this is going to pan out, which is probably why Stammer has said that he's going to wait for a bit and see, one, if they can get the trade deal agreed. I don't know why it hasn't been agreed already with the US, because just putting 10% on everything is going to make it more difficult to get a deal, I suppose. Um, but as I said, it's unlikely that the Americans are going to see any benefit in this in the short term, and in the meantime, they're going to have to pay more for their goods, whether they're homegrown or imported, because of the tariffs and because of the upset in the markets today. I mean, the markets today, you know, you mentioned other markets following the US. Well, actually, it was the other way around. The US was opened this afternoon, our time, to a great flurry, thinking it was going to go high, but it actually tanked for a while. So the market in the US was following the markets around the rest of the world as they opened. The US one is probably last. So I think that the US people working in the stock exchange, for example, got a bit of a shock because they were lauding it to open, thinking it was going to go up as a result of Trump's actions yesterday, and actually it tanked. So, and that's what happens in stock markets, and we see people shifting their money out of stock, which is money that helps companies, into gold, where it just lies there in gold. It doesn't help the economies of any country at all. So, um, I think it's far too early to say what the long term results of this will be, and the rest of the world has not had a chance to come together and decide what, if there's going to be sort of coordinated actions against the tariffs or what. But
Yeah.
interestingly, you did mention that Russia hadn't had any tariffs put on it. So it'd be interesting to see what's going to happen there. Is Trump going to use tariffs in order to force Putin to the table over Ukraine? It all ties in, I suppose.
Looking at the time, we'll move on to our next story in Scottish news. Jamie Green, MSP, has resigned from the Scottish Conservative Party, citing its shift towards adopting far-right Reform UK-esque policies as a reason for his departure. Green, a former leadership hopeful within the party, expressed his concerns in a resignation letter, stating that he no longer recognises the Conservative Party he originally joined. He claims that Scottish Conservatives were moving towards a Trump-esque style of substance, with a focus on appealing to right-wing voters who support the Reform Party. Green, who has been a strong advocate of LGBT rights and opposed his party's stance on the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, Scotland, will now sit as an independent MSP. In his letter to party leader Russell Findlay, Green reflected on his initial attraction to the party, which he described as modern and inclusive, particularly under the leadership of David Cameron. However, he argued that the current direction of the Scottish Conservative Party no longer aligns with the values that initially drew him to the party, such as support for gay marriage, commitment to net zero, and creating a broad political tent. Green criticised the party's current leadership for pursuing policies that he believes will alienate voters, warning that the pursuit of a Reform UK-style agenda risks undermining the party's appeal to the wider electorate. He expressed disappointment that the party, which once worked to shed its quote nasty party image, now faces the prospect of returning to divisive culture wars. Green's resignation highlights growing tensions within the Scottish Conservative Party over their political direction and the increasing influence of more right-wing factions within the party. So, Maureen, what do you make of the resignation, just to start with?
Yeah, well, I suppose I'm not surprised. I'd just like to say Jamie Green made a great speech yesterday in the debate about Christina McKelvey. They were really close friends, and clearly the letter that Jamie Green sent Keith Brown was very moving as well, although we don't know exactly what's in there. But I suspect there was something about his resignation today. But anyway, that's a digression, I suppose. Jamie Green was a decent guy, or is a decent guy. He has his own principles and opinions and was prepared to stick to them while his party moved to the right, as he said. And, you know, you saw today at FMQs that Russell Findlay learnt nothing from yesterday and consensus, and was continuing this right-wing move. I think the interesting things will be whether others join him. There are others, I think, who are retiring but might go independent for the next year, or whether others who intend to stay on in politics, although go independent. That means the end of your career, really. But Jamie Green has very strong principles on LGBT rights, and he's the kind of politician, whether you agree with him or not, has his principles, has his own opinions, and is prepared to stick by them and articulate them. And this is where I think many politicians fall down, is that as an elected leader, you're in a privileged position to be opinion formers rather than opinion followers. And, you know, the rest of the Labour Party, the Tory party who follow Russell Findlay, are following him to the right because of the threat they see from Farage. And in terms of our society as a whole, is that really where we want to go? Oh, clearly, England wants to go further to the right than I think Scotland does. And clearly there are some in Scotland who want to go to the right. But in general, I think Scotland is a much more civic society, a much fairer society. And as opinion formers, as elected leaders, they should be, if they believe in that, they should be singing it from the rooftops, because otherwise you get dragged, in this case, to the right.
Do you think, just before we move on, do you think there is a sizable faction left in the Scottish Conservative Party of people who are more like David Cameron? Because it feels like year by year, there's not that many of them.
So I don't know many of the people that are there now. A lot of them who came in 2021 are in the Tory party were completely new, and of course they were under the leadership of Douglas Ross, who I think is quite far right as well. So yeah, there are what, a handful, maybe more, but in the main they seem to follow their leader. Although I think there are a lot of ructions in the Tory group, that haven't come out into the press. But there are quite a lot of very disillusioned people, and I suppose for the ones that are still there when I were there, they were all very friendly to me yesterday. So are they fed up with the current leadership? Could be.
Looking at the time, we'll move to our next story. Deputy First Minister called for repeal of UK Internal Market Act. Deputy First Minister Kate Forbes has called on the UK government to repeal the Internal Market Act, arguing that it undermines the Scottish Parliament's democratic powers by imposing UK policies in devolved areas. The Scottish government has published a new position paper calling for the repeal of the Internal Market Act 2020, which they argue was introduced without consent of any devolved legislator. The paper suggests that the Act should be replaced by a system based on the Common Frameworks approach, which would involve agreements between the UK government and all devolved administrations. Two votes in the Scottish Parliament have already called for the restoration of powers, but these have been generally ignored by the United Kingdom. The consultation period for the UK government's statutory review of the Internal Market Act has now ended. However, the UK government had explicitly ruled out repealing the Act before the consultation even began. The Scottish government argues that the Act creates uncertainty regarding the impact of devolved laws imposing constraints on the Scottish Parliament. They also claim it grants UK ministers the ability to nullify laws passed by Scotland's elected lawmakers, undermining the authority of the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Government has expressed regret that the UK Government has not considered repealing the Act, but has said that the publication of this new paper offers an opportunity for the UK Government to work with them to restore the democratic powers of the Scottish Parliament. So, Maureen, why do you think that the Act should be removed? Like, what's your case, just to explain to people who maybe don't know as much about it, or what it means?
Right, so I'm not sure I'm a very good position to explain it, but it basically was the Conservatives could see that independence wasn't going to go away, and that support for independence was hovering about the 50% mark and wasn't shifting, even although they tried very hard. So this was one of various measures, the way they wouldn't let the deposit return scheme be enacted, and they wouldn't let the GRA legislation be enacted. To me, the internal market was kind of in that space as well. And I was really surprised that it wasn't one of the first things that the SNP group in Westminster wasn't calling for, and consistently calling for, or that the Labour government itself didn't repeal it. Because if Starmer is really serious about engaging with the devolved administrations, then he needs to be doing something like this, and trying to repair relations that were so fraught between the Scottish government and the Westminster government latterly. So I think this is something I haven't read the paper, but I think it's something that we need to be pushing strongly on over the next months and years to get it repealed because and start again. I know that there's other work going on in terms of rebalancing the relations, in bodies like the British Irish Council and things like that. But it's going to take a lot for the Westminster government, as I say, to start treating the devolved administrations seriously and taking their views seriously. And of course, it hasn't been in terms of, letting us know what they're doing in terms of, or letting the governments know what they're doing in terms of legislation. There's no heads up, for example, from civil service to civil servants to civil servants before something's in the public domain. So yeah, as I say, this is a good move, but it needs to be backed up, not just a one day wonder. It needs to be constantly in the media and on the agenda.
So moving on to our next story, a UK story. Doctors urge UK government to fight poverty and after rise in patients with Victorian era diseases. Doctors in England have reported a rise in Victorian era diseases such as scabies, linking the increase to poor living conditions and growing poverty crisis. A survey of 882 doctors found that 89% were concerned about the impact of health inequalities on their patients. Over the past 3 months, 72% had seen an increase in illness linked to poor housing, air pollution, and limited access to transport. The Royal College of Physicians noted that 46% of respondents said at least half of their workload involved conditions related to social factors. Among the rising conditions, doctors reported an uptick in scabies, a contagious skin disease, and erysipelas, a bacterial infection. Some patients were also suffering from hypothermia due to being unable to afford heating, while others faced poor nutritional status caused by poverty, leading to slow recovery from acute illnesses. These conditions are a direct consequence of poverty, with many people living in cold and damp housing that worsens respiratory illnesses. The Royal College of Physicians has called on the UK government to address the root causes of ill health. The impact of austerity measures and rising poverty is also being felt in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, undermining efforts to reduce health inequalities in the various nations. With financial strain on healthcare systems across the UK, the Royal College urges the government to prioritise addressing the social determinants of bad health, including housing, nutrition, and employment. In response, the UK's Government Department of Health and Social Care has pledged to tackle healthcare inequalities through a plan that aims to halve the gap in life expectancy between the richest and poorest regions in England. However, experts argue that more actual action is needed to prevent further deterioration of public health. So, Maureen, what sort of policies or what policy platform do you think the Labour government can actually enact, like as a government, to try and address these systemic problems?
Well, it's an absolute disgrace that we apparently live in what the sixth richest country in the world, and there's such inequality that we have these Victorian diseases back within our populations. I mean, it's absolutely scandalous. Um, so, one of the things that we can take some comfort from in Scotland is that child poverty levels are lower than England because of things like the child payment. But it's not just the child payment, it's things like, you know, schooling nursery for all 3-year-olds and vulnerable 2-year-olds. It's things like school meals, school breakfasts. It's clear that there's damp housing in Scotland as well as other parts of the UK. But we've seen in food banks, for example, more demand for things like cleaning products and scabies is a result of not having the cleanliness you would like in your home. So you can do things to alleviate, which I think the Scottish Government is trying to do, mainly through the child payment, but these other things that I've mentioned. But it comes back to the big financial inequality that is throughout our populations. And that requires the government that has the economic and financial levers to do something completely different. And shame on them, the Labour government are not prepared to step up and do that. And I think that will really hit them at the ballot boxes, whether it's the council elections in May or hopefully next year in the Scottish Parliament elections. But it also allows, as we've talked about already, the rise of the far right, who have no policies at all, don't articulate any policies, just feed on people's displeasure and disquiet of what's happening now.
So what sort of broader approach do you think Labour should take to tackle this in terms of actual policies?
Well,
Sorry, and just before you answer, where should you get the money, like, to deal with it, if it is money that's needed?
Well, they could have done a budget which was more fair and equal in terms of taxing wealth in other forms. And, we're not just talking about income tax here. There are other forms of tax that could have been implemented. And it requires a government with some backbone to actually take the measures that are needed. I mean, I've mentioned before that my daughter lives in France, and in France, if your place of work doesn't have a works canteen, then you're given food vouchers, meal vouchers, and you can use them in supermarkets, you can use them in restaurants. Now think if you got that here, people could be using that instead of having to go to food banks. So there are various measures that you can do. But, I don't know what's happened to the trade unions these days, but they are not campaigning organisations. Goodness knows what they do. But, the trade unions could step up to the plate, even although it's a Labour government, and start representing their workers. And I think everybody needs to get more angry and get on the streets and campaign, because this is just awful, as I said, in the sixth richest nation.
Moving on to our next story, MAIB published interim report on Solong and Stena Immaculate collision. An investigation into the collision between an oil tanker and cargo ship in the North Sea on the 10th of March has revealed that neither vessel had a dedicated lookout at the time of the incident. The collision occurred about 12 miles off the coast of Yorkshire when the US chartered oil tanker Stena Immaculate was anchored and struck by the container ship Solong. The Solong, which had sailed from Grangemouth on the 9th of March for Rotterdam, collided with the Stena Immaculate, causing a massive fireball from aviation fuel intended for the US Air Force. A significant amount of fuel also leaked into the sea. Tragically, a Filipino sailor aboard the Solong, Mark Perina, is missing and presumed dead. An interim report from the UK Marine Accident Investigation Branch, MAIB, revealed that visibility in the area at the time was patchy, ranging from 0.25 to 2 nautical miles. The report found that Solong's Russian master, Vladimir Motin, was the sole watchkeeper on the bridge for nearly 3 hours before the collision. No dedicated lookout was on duty on either ship. Motion has been charged with gross negligence manslaughter and is set to stand trial in January 2026. The MAIB's ongoing investigation will examine various factors, including the vessel's navigation and watchkeeping practices, their condition and environmental conditions at the time. Salvage operations are underway and experts are assessing the extent of the pollution caused by the incident. Thousands of tiny plastic pellets, known as nurdles, were recovered from the sea, with some washing up on the Norfolk coast. While not toxic, these pellets pose a threat to wildlife. So, Maureen, what do you make of the initial report? And do you think there's any way like we can prevent collisions like that from happening in the future?
Well, it shouldn't have happened in the first place, I don't think, if both ships had been following guidelines and doing their jobs. I mean, the fact there wasn't a lookout and there wasn't anybody in the bridge seems to me absolutely unbelievable, given that they were so close to was it the Humber estuary, I think, and yeah, the Humber estuary, and there was one in at anchor in the estuary, in a designated estuary. So it seems that the the Solong, I think, that was travelling southwards, uh, seems to have been uh, perhaps more negligent than the ship that was at anchor. But nevertheless, given, as I say, the foggy conditions that there were at the time, it seems like gross negligence, and it will, I suppose, we'll have to wait and see how many captains of the whether both captains are to be charged with negligence or not. But it's very serious, and of course, I haven't been down to see it yet. But the Solong is now anchored in Aberdeen Harbour. Goodness knows how long. I hope it's moved before we have the tall ships coming in the summer, because it's not a very good look.
So, moving on to our next story in international news. Viktor Orban says Hungary will leave the International Criminal Court (ICC) as Netanyahu visits the Hungarian capital of Budapest. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban announced that the country would begin the process of withdrawing from the ICC, claiming that the court is becoming politicized. This move comes during a visit by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is currently under ICC arrest warrant for alleged war crimes in the Gaza Strip. Orban confirmed that Hungary would formally initiate withdrawal proceedings, which require parliamentary approval and a notification to the United Nations. The ICC, the world's only permanent global tribunal for war crimes and genocide, expressed concern over Hungary's decision, emphasizing that it weakens efforts to deliver justice for the most serious international crimes. Human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, condemned the move, arguing that it demonstrates that Orban's government has disregard for human rights standards. Human rights watchdog International Justice Director Liz Everson warned that Hungary's departure from the ICC would significantly undermine global human rights protections and weaken respect for the rule of law internationally, not only within Hungary but, well, internationally. Hungary's withdrawal, if completed, would represent a significant step back in the protection of human rights and accountability for war crimes. As a signatory to the Rome Statute, Hungary remains legally obliged to uphold the ICC's provisions, a responsibility that critics argue Orban's government is ignoring. This decision, along with Hungary's frequent opposition to EU sanctions against Israel, underscores Orban's defiant approach to international law and human rights, drawing further scrutiny from global legal and human rights communities. So, Maureen, what do you make of this? And do you think it undermines like the ICC's authority, this action, a country just withdrawing because it doesn't agree politically?
Well, to my earlier list of Putin and Trump being people who create chaos, add to that Netanyahu and Orban. Clearly, I mean, the alliances that are going on in the world at the moment are really mixed up. I mean, it's really quite incredible. And Orban, I don't think um, has the support of his population, and is just doing his own thing, if you like. But he's obviously creating chaos in the EU as well, not adhering to their decisions. So, in terms of the ICC, this is another way of creating chaos by trying to undermine legal international bodies that have been set up for a reason, to keep peace and keep um, a kind of world order. You can see it, Trump doing it with NATO and other um, international organizations. So maybe all our um, items tonight are linked through the word chaos.
I wonder if you think more broadly about like the rules-based international order. Do you think that ever really existed, or do you think this action today maybe proves that is more of like might makes right?
So I suppose there were some countries that didn't agree with the orders, but if you think in recent times, um, there have been outbreaks of wars between countries, always. But I think the desire to create chaos and undermine civilization at the moment seems to me, anyway, to be much more much worse than I can remember, and much more depressing than I can remember. And is it a case of other countries thinking, well, if Trump can do it, then a big country like the US can do it, then we can do it as well. So, yeah, I think there is disruption to world order, and that's exactly what Trump and Putin in the main want. And we can see that their acolytes, Netanyahu and Orban, doing it too, probably at each other's behest on either side.
Looking at the time, we'll move on to our second last story in Scottish news. The Scottish Government to bring forward a bill on decarbonising homes and buildings. The Scottish Government plans to introduce a revised Heat in Buildings Bill in 2025, setting a target to decarbonise heating systems by 2024 while addressing fuel poverty. Acting Minister for Climate Action, Alistair Allen, confirmed the Scottish Government's intention to bring the bill before the Scottish Parliament later this year. The bill will include a new target for decarbonising all heating systems in Scotland by 2045, which aims to encourage homeowners, landlords, and building owners to prepare for the upcoming change. It will also introduce measures to promote the development of heat networks, particularly for large non-domestic premises, and enable public sector buildings to connect to district heat where available. Additionally, the bill will grant powers to set minimum energy efficiency standards for both owner-occupied and non-domestic properties. In addressing concerns raised during consultation, the Scottish Government has committed to find a balance between decarbonising goals and reduction of fuel poverty. The bill will focus on supporting vulnerable households, especially those in rural areas and islands where decarbonisation may be more difficult due to geographical challenges. The legislation will be technologically neutral to accommodate the different needs of various properties, with rural areas potentially requiring district solutions compared to urban regions. It will complement ongoing work on a social housing net zero standards and reform energy performance certificates. So, Maureen, I was sort of reading this legislation before we came on, and a big part of it was the new target that I mentioned for 2045. And do you think maybe it's not the wisest way to do climate policy by making these targets? Because a lot of governments have been setting these targets and then a couple of years later going back on them, including the Scottish Government, I guess, which was well publicised when the Greens left the coalition. So do you think maybe setting targets like this could risk making the public lose faith in sort of climate responses and maybe going elsewhere?
No, I think you have to have targets, otherwise it just kind of falls off the radar. And I remember when we had the legislation on, yeah, so to do with the climate climate change regulation, and we had annual targets. And I remember that going through Parliament. I thought that was sorry, I can't remember the name of the target. Um, it maybe it was net zero target. Anyway, we had a an annual target was put in, and I just thought that was absolutely stupid, because some years you can do more than other years, and to expect a reduction every year was just ridiculous. And I'm not sure that it's easier to do urban areas than rural areas. I mean, it'll cost more to do rural areas, but if you're talking about individual households, it's probably easier for households to put in alternative renewable energy than people who are on the gas grid, for example, until you are in a position, for example, to change the whole system to hydrogen or whatever. So, and people are less likely, if in an urban area, if they're just doing it themselves, especially in council areas. And district heating is a way to go forward. There's another way that doesn't involve government legislation, and I've talked to people in the city of London about this. That when businesses are asking for financial help, whether it be from banks or enterprise agencies or things, when companies are drawing up their business plan, I think they should be made to, one, make sure that they're doing so, if they're employing people, that they're doing so at the real living wage, and two, that they're going into buildings that are as net zero as possible. Because if you give money, especially public money, but also private money, you should be using that as a lever to move climate change action forward. And that's not happening at the moment. So I think the target is more realistic than, I think he said 2024, which is already passed. So I think
Oh
it's
no, sorry,
a more
2045.
realistic.
Yeah.
Yeah, but what was it in the old legislation? Um, I think that's more realistic, because we have just got to steadily work at this, and new technologies will come on stream all the time, and renewable technologies will get cheaper. But it's really difficult at the moment to switch from either gas or in my area, for example, oil, because we're not on the gas grid. For households, it's not easy to decide what renewable system they're going to go for.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's lots still to
Yeah.
do.
I mean, like, I do see your reasoning for having a longer sort of target. I see the, like, go more public trust in that, I guess, and having 2024 or whenever it was you mentioned the other target was for. I just feel like quite a lot of people I know, they'll see, like, politicians making targets, and then they'll think, like, they'll see it as an easy sort of political win. Like, it's easier to say, we'll do this by this year, and it's harder to actually, do the stuff, basically, to actual legislation. That's sort of the point I'm getting at, rather than saying targets themselves are just bad.
Yeah, but if you take health, for example, if you didn't have targets for waiting times at A&E, then you wouldn't have doctors and consultants working to their maximum output and productivity. We still haven't got productivity in the health service back to pre-COVID levels, even with an increase in staff. So, yeah, I think, and there's got to be this kind of competition, like between health boards, and to get them to, realize that targets are important for the public that they're serving. So, whether that's a good analogy with targets for changing your heating system, I don't know, but I hope you get my point.
Okay, looking at the time, I'll just quickly run for the next story because we're about on the hour. So the Scottish Government announced its, or our last story, the Scottish Government announced its free independent legal advice pilot for victims of rape. Victims of rape and attempted rape in Scotland will soon be able to access free independent legal advice through a new pilot scheme funded by the Scottish Government. Announced by Justice Secretary Angela Constance, the pilot aims to improve the experience of victims in the criminal justice process. The pilot, unveiled during a session of the Scottish Parliament Criminal Justice Committee, will provide specialist legal support to complainers in rape and attempted rape cases. The initiative is a partnership with the University of Glasgow's Emma Rich Law Clinic, offering victims access to dedicated solicitors and experienced court practitioners. The solicitors will help victims understand their rights and feel more prepared when giving evidence. This support will be available throughout the process and beyond if needed. The initiative is part of the Scottish Government's broader efforts, including proposals in the Victims' Witness and Justice Reform Bill to improve victims' experience in the criminal justice system. An advisory group will be formed to assist in the development of the pilot, with further details to be provided later. So, Maureen, what do you make of that story, just before we wrap things up?
Yeah, no, it's really good, and it'll be interesting to see what the results of the pilot are. I mean, you don't know how much legal assistance costs until you actually have to do it. I mean, it's enormous, and it's difficult to access legal aid too. And if this pilot is working with students or law students, then this is good practice for them too. But in the case of rape, and we're in a situation where domestic abuse and abuse of women is increasing, this is a good move.
So that's all I've got time for. It's calling to 7. So thanks to our guest, Maureen. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you for having me.
Sorry, jumped a bit. But before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We were 16,000 short of our funding requirement in 2024, which has left us short of the money we need to pay our bills. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around £2,500. We've raised £8,000 so far this year, but we urgently need an additional £4,000 to pay our bills. Our programs will always be free to view. However, if you can afford just £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. So goodbye and thanks for watching.